in Quebec and in Canada. Thank you.
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, securing a new softwood lumber agreement with the United States that works for all of Canada is a priority for the Prime Minister and our government. The forestry sector is an essential part of the economic prosperity of the country, including the provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Prince Edward Island. The Government of Canada is fully aware of the vital role that the softwood lumber industry plays in Atlantic Canada. This is why the Minister of International Trade, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade, and officials from Global Affairs Canada have been collaborating closely with the industry and the provincial governments of the Atlantic provinces. The Atlantic region, often referred to as the Maritimes in a softwood lumber context, has a long-standing and unique position in the ongoing trade dispute between Canada and the United States. This century-old irritant in the bilateral trade relationship is rooted in differences in forest management practices in each country. In the United States, most timber is harvested from private lands with the cost of timber determined by the market. In Canada, the majority of forests are publicly owned, which would be 92%, and provinces employ a range of administrative mechanisms to determine the market-based rates and that are charged to industry for harvesting from Crown lands. However, the U.S. lumber industry has argued that the price charged by provinces is a subsidy to Canadian lumber producers. We reject such assertions out of hand, Mr. Speaker. Canadian lumber is market-priced, period. But the Maritimes are exceptional in the fact that a significant percentage of timber in this region comes from private lands. Furthermore, the price for Crown timber in the Maritimes has been and continues to be based on the large pool of private transactions. Over the past 35 years of the softwood lumber dispute, the United States government and the U.S. industry have consistently acknowledged that the lumber sourced from the Atlantic region was not subsidized. Exports of softwood lumber products from the Maritimes have never been found to be subsidized in any previous U.S. countervailing duty investigations into softwood lumber from Canada and have been excluded from every previous agreement. With the dates as far back as 1987-1988, amendment to the Softwood Lumber MOU, which was further enshrined in the 1996 Maritime Lumber Agreement, also known as the Maritime Accord. The most recent chapter in the long-standing history of being excluded from the softwood lumber dispute was the 2006 Softwood Lumber Agreement, under which softwood lumber products from the Maritimes, defined in the agreement as New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador, were excluded from export measures. The Maritimes and the northeastern states have century-old interlinked economic relationships. Much like Canada's relationship with the United States, the Atlantic region's relationship with New England is vital to the economic prosperity of both sides of our borders. Forest products are key to our part in this economic partnership. This government has prioritized rebuilding Canada's important and strategic relationship with the United States, which has suffered over the last decade. Improving the tenor and tone of our bilateral engagement with the United States is critical to finding a solution to the softwood lumber issue. Ultimately, Canada, in collaboration with the 4 Atlantic provinces and all other provinces and territories, is focused on finding a durable and equitable solution, and one that benefits softwood lumber producers across Canada, as well as related industries and consumers. Mr. Speaker, this government understands the importance of the forestry sector and softwood lumber trade with the United States for the provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. The forestry sector supports over 19,000 direct and indirect jobs and communities in the Atlantic provinces. These are primarily in rural communities, and these jobs are vital to our regions. In 2015, the Atlantic provinces exported 8.7% of total Canadian softwood lumber to the United States by volume, valued at approximately $495 million. The Atlantic softwood lumber industry is a major contributor to the broader forestry sector. Mr. Speaker, this government recognizes that softwood lumber is more than dimensional lumber. It is about the success of an entire economic sector and of rural communities. That is why this government is working so hard to negotiate a successor Softwood Lumber Agreement that will provide stability and certainty for forestry workers in Atlantic Canada and across our country. This government has worked closely with Atlantic Canada and will continue this dialogue as we move forward together. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of International Trade and the officials from Global Affairs Canada have consulted extensively with government officials from the 4 Atlantic provinces and with several industry stakeholders, including the Atlantic lumber producers. All have been unanimous in their discussions with the Minister of International Trade that they would support an agreement that works for all of Canada. However, they have been clear that given the historical record and the fact that maritime system remains effectively unchanged, the Maritimes should be excluded from future subsidy investigations and exempt from border measures under future Softwood Lumber Agreement, as the region has traditionally been. Mr. Speaker, that is why this government ensured that the leader's statement on softwood lumber from the Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama last June clearly stated that a key feature in any softwood lumber agreement would have provisions for regions or company exclusions. The governments of the Atlantic provinces and their industry have been clear about their interest in a new agreement, and this government has listened. The Prime Minister and the Minister of International Trade will continue to push for the consultation and the continuation of the maritime exclusion as we negotiate with the United States. Rest assured, this government will continue to defend the interests of Atlantic Canada's softwood lumber industry and the industry as a whole from coast to coast to coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I congratulate my colleague for her speech, but we've heard this narrative from the government side where they want to tell us, that they've turned the corner on the relationship with the United States, that they've got a great relationship with the United States, and apparently the previous government didn't. None of that is really true. And if you look at the results, you would expect, if that were the case, that they would have been able to achieve results on this deal. But after 3 months when the Conservatives were in power, we achieved results. We got a deal done. They've had a year. They still haven't gotten a deal done. So I want to ask the member, if the relationship with the United States is such that the Prime Minister and others have said it is, then why can't they actually effectively advance Canada's interests in the context of this relationship? Why aren't we using supposedly that relationship to actually get results for the Canadians we're supposed to be representing?
Honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. I would say there's a number of issues there. Over the past 10 years, our industries have changed, our economies have changed, the competing products have also changed. So within that 10-year period, I would wonder what was being done to support the lumber industry as it was. We've heard from people before the International Trade Committee about the loss of market share during that 10-year period. It wasn't only due to the lack of negotiations, it was also due to the changing markets. Between 2005 and 2009, 70% of the softwood lumber exports to the U.S. plummeted from the Atlantic provinces to the U.S. There was a declining housing market. In addition to that, we hear from Duncan Davies. He is the executive director or the president of Interfor Corporation from British Columbia. He talked about the loss of market share to competing products. So within that 10-year period, the market changed. There was the introduction of competing products such as steel, composite, and cement in the housing industry. We also have to have agreements, 2016, 10 years later, that reflects the changing market not only in our side of the border, but also in the U.S. side of the border, because they're looking to protect their own industry. So we have to find an agreement that works best for both sides of this border. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for, Fundy Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for the work that she's doing with the Standing Committee on International Trade, and I understand that the committee traveled to Atlantic Canada this fall, and I'm wondering if the member could tell us of any feedback that she received from the industry in Atlantic Canada about trade and specifically the upcoming agreement.
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
I thank my honourable colleague from Fundy Royal. Yes, we heard before the Trade Committee from Gaston Patois. He is the chair of the Atlantic Lumber Producers. More than 50% of the timber that is exported is actually from private land, so that does make a difference. They do not want to see a change to that. They also talked about the significance of the new surveying methods that have been used in Atlantic Canada, and those surveying methods are actually keeping a track and collecting data on the stumpage rates in Atlantic Canada. So also we have evidence when if there is an opening of the agreement and the Maritimes are looked at being part of potentially for tariffs and non-tariff issues, that the evidence is there to suggest that we are well in compliance and we are not a subsidized industry. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Nous avons le temps pour une question.
We have time for one brief question. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. I thank my colleague for her speech. What worries me is jobs and the time taken for negotiations. But the more time is going by, the more jobs are at risk. So I'd like to know if my colleague and for the government is not worried that in January, February, and March the Americans will impose new duties. So I'd like to know from my colleague if the government has in mind any kind of support to help the workers or to educate people in the forestry sector.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question. Certainly supporting any aspect of the softwood lumber industry is absolutely critical for this government. And I would say for everyone here in the House, I think we stand united that we do not want to see job losses, that we also want to see the industry supported. We also want to see the industry supported with adaptability. We've heard from a number of people before the International Trade Committee of the importance of adaptability, of entering new markets, not being so as dependent in one market, looking at how we need to diversify and become innovative. We had to do that largely in Atlantic Canada because of our traditionally heavily dependence on with trade with the U.S. But certainly it is a concern. Anytime there's jobs lost in any of our communities, but especially in rural communities, job losses are extremely significant because it's such a ripple effect. And we've seen from Atlantic Canada so many families that have moved from the east to the west to search for jobs and not come back.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Prince George Peace.